Okay, so today I thought I would get to your questions on Patreon. I printed them out. And a number of the questions are about backlit painting, keeping your darks dark, and medium and terps and their usage, and approaches to laying in. Now, since all of these things are very related, I thought what I would try to do is something a bit different where I'm going to do a copy of, probably won't finish the whole painting, but I'll show you the difference in approach for doing a backlit painting, frontlit painting, and then a frontlit painting with evening light, because I think that the approaches for those three are very different, and it also changes quite dramatically how you used the turpentine in the medium, so we can talk about that. And then with backlit paintings, you do often need to get your colors quite dark. So we'll talk a bit about that. We won't get to thoughts on finish in the painting, but we can do that. That was something I wanted to talk about maybe next month, because I wanted to look at compositions of other artists and talk about why compositions work. I feel like I did one earlier in the year, but I think there's a lot more I want to say about that. So I thought I'll get to that next time. And somebody asked about cliffside, so this will touch on that. And we can talk about calligraphy in your brushwork as well, and painting loose versus painting tight, and how to find your own voice in your painting. So we can do that today. One question as well I got was how to handle creative block. And this is an interesting question, which today doesn't really affect me as much as it did when I was starting out. I think that, for one thing, I'm just in this rhythm now with my life where I paint all the time. There's also a weird kind of, basically the financial side of painting is a bit strange. I mean, right now I'm only living off of my painting. In the past, I've taught a lot, and I actually think it's better to teach and some of the time and have a balance in your income sources, because if you only rely on selling paintings, then you become very dependent on the galleries and on the sales. If you only depend on teaching, you often don't have enough time to paint your own work, and so it's nice to have a balance of the two. Anyways, as far as right now, for me, I have this strange financial incentive to paint, which basically means I can't have artist block. But this painting was painted this month, and I won't sell it for another year probably. So I have this constant system where I'm painting, and I know that I won't get any income from the work until a year from now. So, and I've had enough periods in my life where I really struggled financially, and so I've just gotten in the habit of constantly working, and there's this kind of inertia that you get into, an object in motion stays in motion. And so when you get into the habit of painting all the time, then it's hard to actually stop painting. And like I said, I don't have the luxury of being even able to stop painting right now. That said, I do have some good suggestions for getting out of artist block earlier on, and these are things that I found were really useful for getting back out painting when you didn't want to, when you have when you have the stability to and the luxury of not being able to paint. I've definitely seen lots of artists who stop painting and they take forever to get back in, and it can be quite difficult. So these are some things that I would recommend. For one thing, if you just kind of have a general idea of saying, I need to paint, that can be very intimidating. I think it's easier to kind of break it down into little chunks. So if you say, okay, I need to, paint a backlit view, or I need to, work on my trees because I'm not tapering my branches correctly. You can sort of go out and just look for a little thing that you need to work on. That is one way that in the past I've gotten back to work when I wasn't able to work, is just to say, I want to work on something, just a small thing, even take a small panel and just work on something that you're kind of struggling with, rather than, this kind of nebulous, I need to paint. Another thing that is great is finding inspiration in the work of other artists. And what I found that really works in this case, there were periods I remember when I had artist block in Florence when I was living there. And what I would do is I would look at the local Florentine painters. So these were the Macchioli, the 19th century painters. And I would look at some of their street scenes, which were, painted in areas around town. And then I would find something that inspired me in their work. And then I would go out and copy that, or try to find either the same place or a similar view. And you can do this even with artists from other parts of the world. You can say, okay, I really like this backlit mountain, by the ocean, and then go out and find something similar to that, and use the inspiration that you have from looking at the work of other artists, and use that as sort of a springboard to push you into painting again. I still think the local artists, so just find, some local painter earlier in the century is often good, because the earlier last century, the craftsmanship was very good. So, and then find a painting of theirs that you like, and either go to the same spot or try to do something that's similar. And like I say, use that inspiration of seeing another artist's work as a way of pushing yourself to get outside. So those are my two suggestions for getting over artist block. Either take small pieces of the process and try to work on a small thing at the time, and then you'll just end up kind of getting over the inertia. And the other thing is to look for inspiration in local painters, and then go out and try to do something similar. So now, with that said, I'm going to get started here. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to mass in this sort of painting, and I'll show you how I would go about massing in a backlit painting first, and then we'll talk about how that differs from laying in on frontlit painting at midday, and how that differs from painting on from massing in on a frontlit painting with evening light. Okay, so get started. First, I'm going to top up my medium, and then I'll top up my solvent. And like I say, I'm using lavender essence because my wife suffers from an allergy to turpentine. But lavender essence and turpentine both don't dry very fast. And what's great about that is it doesn't tack up while I'm working, and I don't have to wash my brushes every day. I can, keep them in the freezer. These brushes I used yesterday, and just dump them in the studio, and the paint's completely wet. Also, for larger projects, I like to scrape down, and I often like to scrape down the next day. And so I like using this medium and this a solvent that doesn't dry too quickly because I find it really helps with the painting. Some people use like a faster drying medium. I find it tacks up too much, especially if you're working in sunlight, and then you risk killing your brushes if you don't clean them or put them in the freezer overnight. I've also seen artists who like, I knew an artist who painted with poppy oil, and it would take 6 months to dry. So it can be a question of personal preference, but I will explain, I'll show you here how I basically use the medium and the terps. Especially, I'll use a lot of it when I'm laying in on a backlit painting. So what I tend to do is dip both into the medium and the terps at the beginning. And basically the idea is that you want to have your paint quite liquid to lay in, because what I'm going to do is kind of mass in a whole general color for this dark area. And then I'll paint into that. And I mean, it's kind of hard to see because I covered it over, but that's how I approached this when I painted it the first time. And the same with the water. I would have just masked it all in and then painted into that because it keeps the edges quite soft, which is kind of the effect you have both in water and in general in shadow areas. These edges could be softer still, but so making this kind of soup and then making a kind of a grayish color. Now, somebody asked about getting the darkest dark. It's rare that you actually want your darkest dark in landscape painting. So I'm going to start with ochre here, even though it's not the darkest black I can get. The darkest black would be with the cad yellow. But we're going to get kind of a green, and then I'll add a touch of the red to it. And it should get very gray. Somebody was complaining that it looks too purple, but I mean, that gets quite gray. So purple, ultramarine, red, and a yellow. And then what's nice about the medium is it allows you to cover a large area very quickly. So here I've taken medium and terps at 2 different times, but it's a very, very loose liquid color. And I'm able to cover the panel quite quickly. And then I can put in sort of darker areas and leave other areas a bit lighter where I'm going to be covering things up with, where I'll be painting the lights sort of trickling down the cliffs. So let's see. And then these little guys out here. And what's so different about this is that when you're painting a backlit painting, you basically just mask everything in as shadow. And then using this kind of like a soup, what you can do later is go back in and, change the colors a bit. But you're going to keep these soft edges, which are generally how shadows appear to us. You're going to keep them quite thin as well. I mean, you can put impastos in later. And I'll tend to use just this one brush the entire time for shadow areas because I want all of these colors to be quite close together. So even when if I need to add a touch of white because there's an area with some reflected light or a lighter kind of stone, I can add a bit of white to it and then keep it kind of muddy. And then I can take it dark again. And at this point, I'm adding more pigment to my soup here But because I'm adding more pigment, it's very easy for me to cover. You know, if I take, let's see, if I take just medium and especially terps and add a bit of color to it, and I try to add this to it, you know, it's going to take off what was there before. I guess you can put it down too, but you can see how it picks up the little, it picks up the color that was there before. And the solution to that is at the beginning you add more terps, but then as you keep working, you add more medium and more pigment. And then by the end of the, you know, as you're going over this, at the end, you're basically going to be adding just pigment, no medium and no terps. And then it's very easy to cover in, you know, the soup and make changes. Whereas if you add a lot of terps at this stage, once you have a base, it's going to pick the color off. So start with the terps and the medium, then go to more medium, and then go to just pure paint. So yeah, keep all of these kind of, it's a bit too green, so add a touch of red. Edge is quite soft, and then all of the values very compressed. And then the same thing with the water. Now this, you know, I had this kind of light effect there, the sparkles, and I can remember how I did this. I would go in with kind of a dark, you know, if you squint down, there's a certain point when the reflection, because you're looking down, starts to get more and more of the sky and less of what's underneath. And so that's about sort of here, it gets kind of darker. But I think I masked in the whole thing all the way up with this kind of sort of a muddy blue. And I might have left kind of the accents around this, you know, here it's going to be mostly white, so I'm better off not painting that area with the blue because then I'll have to fight it later. But I can just mass in everything with a ton of medium and a ton of terps. And I remember I've painted this, you can see how it gets really dark around here. It was actually all the same color, but I got it darker as I got down next to the whites so that the whites would pop more because, you know, it's pure light and it's just impossible with oil paint to kind of capture. So remember that this is light and shade. So there, once I have this all kind of masked in, then I can start going in with, again, keep using the same brush because everything's really close in value, and make some lighter areas, some accents. You know, remember these shadows are coming down. The reflections are coming down, and since they're backlit, it's also a shadow. And then basically when you get into the lights, you're not going to want to use any turpentine, but you're going to use a lot of paint. because then you can quickly cover this stuff without it getting muddy. And the question as to how to keep your colors clean, you basically just have to keep coming back and getting a clean, you can only get a certain distance of brush work before the brush is going to get too muddy, and then you're going to have to come back to it to grab new color, clean color. And as far as the question goes for the darkest dark, you can have two little lines of pigment as well, and using a clean brush and clean blue, touch of a very clean red, and then the cad yellow medium. I don't find it gets too purple. I mean, that's almost a touch too green. Then we go in with the red, it's going to be a very neutral dark. And then even adding more yellow, I think it's going to, if you're using these Williamsburg cadmiums, which are so strong, I find it doesn't really get too light. And remember to use the kind of color next to this to make these lines even thinner. So now we'll take a touch of, make a kind of a bright green for some of these little accents. And here, it's maybe a touch too light. And as your brush gets muddy, go back in. Remember to make sure your shadows and lights are lining up with the colors. So if here there's a little bush, make sure we have a dark green continuing those areas. And try to keep the edges and the shadows quite soft. And then for the whites, I kind of really went for it with these impastos. And leaving kind of the canvas blank there just means I don't have to fight. I think I actually painted this all blue and then went in with the white over it, but it makes more sense to do it this way, where you leave it blank, and then that allows you to paint very easily into those areas. And then where you have put paint down, basically, you're just going to get a few little sparkles before you have to go back to get clean paint, and you'll just be constantly picking up clean paint. And I often will put these little kind of sparkles down, and then I'll take the blue, maybe a sable, and kind of, again, here there's too much turpentine and medium, so the paint isn't going onto the canvas. But you can kind of make the sparkles the right size by painting over them. And again, I sort of went in darker, in some of these areas next to the sparkles to really get them to pop. I guess next to this dark cliff, we do have a bit of a lighter area of the water. So, and again, with these backlit paintings, you don't need a lot of clean color. You know, everything's really kind of muddy. This is the Zeki Cerulean, which is fantastic, especially for the price. So there we kind of pull this out. This one is actually spotted wrong, or maybe this is too far over. Anyways, I'm not trying to do a perfect reproduction here. I just wanted to, it's just sort of to explain how you go about backlit painting. So basically, mass in a thin area, a thin wash, and then paint into that. And that's, like I say, is going to be very different when we get to painting a frontlit view, sort of a midday frontlit view where everything is broken into the separate colors. So here, again, no medium or terps, just pigment so that I'm able to cover these areas. And let's see, kind of a darker area there. And, you know, as I was painting this, you know, the sun would be here, so the light on the water would be over here. And then as the sun goes this way, that's going to move along. And so you have to sort of pick your moment of when you find it more interesting. So, and then I would have really looked sort of for the different colors and values in these cliffs, especially to kind of, you know, keep some of the accents very thin. And then where there was, you know, there's going to be a lot of kind of reflected light. And so by the end, you've basically painted over all of your mass, your wash, but it's picking up a bit of the color each time. So you're basically going to end up with this area here, which is very, you know, the shadows have a bit of all the colors in them. So it's going to be very, I mean, here it's an even a better example. It's just going to end up being a very simplified mass, which is basically, you know, the way you see an object outside backlit. These are all going to kind of blend together. Okay. So I'm not going to finish these paintings. I will now switch over and we will talk about how to handle a frontlit painting in a midday, which is a completely different approach. Okay, so for the next example, I'm going to do, this is basically a flatlit painting, late morning, midday, and it requires basically a completely different approach than painting a backlit view. Whereas with the backlit view, we started by massing in, general large areas with a frontlit view. Basically, you can't really do that. You can do it a bit, maybe down in areas like this, because this idea of compression of values. But basically, all of these areas, and you can see sort of in, the orange that comes through you can see in these areas, the orange that comes through the paint, I haven't masked in at all here. So everything was put on one by one, color by color. And in painting these frontlit views, you have to be much slower about mixing your colors. You have to be much more precise. I mentioned this when I did the last painting, but when you paint these backlit views, it's much more about the values. So I wasn't that concerned with the colors, even when I was doing the copy. Whereas when you're painting a frontlit view, it's much more about color. So basically all of these different colors are, have to be very, very accurate. The values have to be very accurate. Whereas I think with the backlit views, you have a lot more leeway with the colors, certainly, and you can play with the values a bit. But with the colors, you can certainly, if it's too green or too red, it's really not going to be a big deal. Whereas with these frontlit views, I find that it's much harder to get away without really nailing the colors, and also like nailing all the little variety in the colors. I was paying much more attention to the gradations here, and each one of these little shadow areas has a different color, and so it ends up going much slower. And I mean, I didn't paint the sky the last time, but we can sort of look at how, you would normally actually go about painting. Sorry, I'm going to kind of reduce everything here. Painting the sky first. There was a question about the brushstrokes I put in the sky too. I mentioned somewhere else, I think that this comes from looking at the work of Daubigny. He tended to have his skies quite broken up, whereas a lot of the other landscape painters tended to have them more polished, especially at his time. But I always loved the way to me, it reads like air when you have kind of a broken light effect in the broken color in the sky. But I will say that a lot of my galleries have actually asked me not to do it. Not a lot, but a couple have asked me to make the skies more polished. They said their clients don't like it. So once I actually had to repaint a large painting because the client didn't like my brushy sky. So, it's a bit of a taste issue. And there are going to be people who, prefer the movement in the sky, and people who want it more polished. So it's, like I say, it tends to be just how I read when I look at the sky outside. I just don't, I guess you can see it all polished, but to me it has a very different feel than the elements below, where I often have, more solid kind of areas. And as we get down to the bottom of the sky, remember to kind of make it a bit muddy. So we'll add a bit of red and a bit of yellow. And then distant mountains, start with ultramarine and add a touch of ochre. And I think I tried to keep my sky, my distant mountains quite soft. Maybe a bit too dirty because of taking a dirty brush. Add some cleaner color. And then the distant water, I'll just try to get sort of the closest I can get with a small brush. But then I will take color of the water. The distance back there tends to go more sort of ultramarine or cobalt. And then I'll try to paint the beach quite small by using the colors on each side. This is the cobalt, it's probably a better color. And again, that's probably all I can really mass in is some of the water. As far as the, when you get into the cliffs, I remember painting this and, I wouldn't, you could say, oh, well, why don't you just put the whole hillside in like that, but I'm basically going to have to paint everything over it. So there's not really any point to then kind of fighting it. So I think a better way to, and I want to keep it kind of thick too. So I don't want to have a wash that I'm now kind of struggling to cover. So I think it's better to just to go right in. Let's take this hill here, and really just sort of slowly work my way down like an inkjet printer, sort of just scanning, seeing where the colors change. But there's no need to put in an underlayer and then paint over it. So I would just try to get each color, each shape. I guess this should be much smaller. And then as we get down below, gets into these kinds of oranges and reds. And let's see some of these accents too. Like I say, each little accent is going to have to be, sort of correctly observed, carefully mixed, and you're just going to have to go slowly, sort of one by one. And I mean, for me, I think that's why I kind of like painting either completely flat lit or completely backlit when I'm painting these cliffs, because I find all of this, these shadows can break the form up too much. And especially if the sun was over there, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of kind of parallel lines, which aren't very picturesque. So you want to try to pick your moments better. And I personally found that I much prefer the cliff paintings when they're either entirely front lit or entirely backlit. But so continuing on, water is a bit greener, and because of the soft edges, again, you can go in and put in the water as a large mass and then paint into it, and to try to keep all your edges quite soft. But you know, these kinds of areas, basically, you can't really mass in. You're going to need each color observed one by one, and then placed so when I was saying that for me, I find backlit views much easier, I think part of it is this, that it's, I like the sort of massing in and then painting into the soup, whereas this sort of, you know, working your way down and carefully capturing each shape, getting the color exactly right, keeping all of your edges pretty sharp. That's sort of how I see these areas. And I mean, I think these kinds of views can be really beautiful, and I definitely like painting them, but I've just noticed that for me, I try to do kind of a variety of work. So, you know, like we just were in the Algarve, and I would definitely think, okay, yesterday I painted a backlit view, so, or two backlit views. So today let's try to do some frontlit views, because I don't want to have an entire body of work that looks exactly the same. On the other hand, I do notice that I have a different a definite preference, and you know, if I'm painting with the high sun in midday, I find that it's often very picturesque to have especially in certain areas. So southern Portugal, where it's hot and dry, I think normally, and it depends a bit on your subject. But Portugal, California, I tend to find that I really like the silhouettes. And so painting something with the high sun, backlit midday is very pleasing. When I'm painting sort of early morning or late at night, I actually prefer the low sun, where everything is kind of covered in this sort of orange soup. And again, I'll show you how to approach that next, because it's different from these high sun backlit paintings. But like, you know, we were just spent the summer in the Gers in France, and there I found that a lot of the best views were frontlit, because it was sunflowers or wheat, and I think that those two subjects tended to be more interesting when they were flooded with light, and they tended to be really nice with the high sun, sort of midday frontlit views. Whereas somewhere like Portugal or California, I find that it's more appealing to me to paint backlit with the high sun. So it depends a bit on where you are too, and what sort of subject matter you're looking at. So again, I mean, it's going to be very slow going to kind of capture each little color change, but that's basically how you have to handle these frontlit views. They're going to take much longer. Every little nuance needs to be captured. You can play with the impastos much more. I don't find the impastos work particularly well in shadow areas, but definitely for lights, you know, they can make for a much more interesting surface. And if the painting is lit right at the end too, it'll, you know, add more light to your lights. I'm going to try to have these kind of really warm shadow areas. Let's see, that's about here. And then we have kind of this. And then again over here, you can't really, you know, lay in a mass because you're just going to have to repaint everything anyways. So again, a little kind of laser printer, you know, you just have to find, okay, here we have a whole bunch of sort of kind of a light cad yellow areas in here. And then we're going to have some areas that are a bit more ochre. And then we're going to have a bunch of areas that are quite a gray. So, you know, these kinds of bluer. And I mean, right now I'm using the same brush, but I think if I was out in the field, I would probably find it easier to keep changing brushes. And then again down here, everything changes again. Even in the green here, the last painting, the backlit one, I was able to get away with just, you know, a light and a dark. Whereas here you're going to have kind of a mid-tone, maybe even a bit darker up next to the lights. And there's a bunch of blues in there, greens. And so you're just going to see every little change in hue, and everything needs to be kind of dealt with one color at a time. Some reflections there. Also, there was a question about calligraphy in brushwork. I will say that I almost never have. I mean, here there's a few that were probably single brush strokes, but so much of the time the lines that I like, that I would consider calligraphic in my work, you know, say these little sails back here on the sailboat. You know, they look like these really clever, you know, one little shot brushstroke, thick at the bottom, and then getting kind of thinner up above. But I mean, I know for a fact that I never get, you know, a brushstroke right away. And so what often in my own painting, and I think probably in a lot of other artists too, what looks like a very clever calligraphic brushstroke was actually very slowly was put down, maybe with a kind of a calligraphy, but so often in my own paintings, it's not calligraphy. It's that I've gone back afterwards and made it look like a calligraphic brushstroke by editing the shape with the color around it. So I think it's much easier to get a clever brushstroke. Well, try to get the color right by manipulating it than just by getting a masterful. Now, I mean, there's, you have these Eastern art forms which are based a lot on the calligraphy in the brushwork, but that's never really been how I handled them. You can definitely do that, but I find it much easier to get a calligraphic brushstroke by shaping it with the negative shape around it. So, I mean, there's definitely, you can play with the impastos, and that can be quite fun. A lot of that has to do with the quality of the paint too. So if you're using like this Williamsburg titanium that's really quite thick, you can get these really nice handling, this really nice play on the surface, in part just because the paint does what you want it to. I think that if you're using some other brands that are either more liquid or stiffer, you might find that this kind of handling is much harder to do. And certainly with lead whites, if you're ever painting portraiture, you look at those Rembrandt paintings where they have these long stringy highlights, and you can't do that with a lot of with a student grade paint. But if you buy what's the brand, Rublev's lead white, or you ground your own, you get that stringy effect, and you can see how Rembrandt would have done it. But like I say, I think when I first started out, I just assumed that it was entirely up to skill, but actually I don't think Rembrandt could have done his impastos with student grade paint. So yeah, as I continue down, basically it's this idea of just never really having any kind of masked in areas. I'll even show you like how I would have handled these rocks. You can put them in more or less, all the way across. But here, again, it's because of this sort of idea of compression of values. And because there is a general color which is more present than some of the other ones. So it's just going to be a quicker way to kind of go in and cover it like that. But then you are going to have to go in over the top of that. No medium, no terps, just color, and put in some of these the dark blues for the water. We'll get out a very small brush for just the little cast shadow in these little tide pools. And yeah, I guess it was a shade darker. And again, here, I've just painted this slightly too light and it looks completely wrong. Whereas with the backlit painting, I think you have a lot more leeway in making mistakes. both in color and in value, whereas these front-lit paintings really have to be, everything has to be perfect. See, even there, it's a bit too cool, touch too dark, so I'll have to fix that. Okay, I'm going to stop there. But so that's the general idea for a front-lit high sun painting. Is you basically have to slow down and just hit every color one by one, and they all have to be really, really accurate. So that's how I handled this when I painted it in life. And you know, maybe the other one would have been a 2-hour, hour and a half, 2-hour painting. This was probably a 3-hour painting, precisely because of this, because it just requires a very sort of slow and methodical, both getting the color right and the value right on the palette, and then putting it in exactly the right place on the panel. So this is the difference with a backlit painting to a frontlit painting, where, you know, here you mass in and then you can change it, and you don't have to get it entirely right. You just have to make sure the relationships are good. And again, I exaggerated stuff down here. Whereas here, the relationships all have to be perfect and the colors all have to be perfect. Okay, so this is the last of the three. And this is another frontlit painting, but evening light, low sun. And I think, you know, if you look historically, you'll find that a lot of the paintings, you know, it's usually often these, you know, one of these three light effects. If you go look at the Soroyas and the Soroya Museum, you see a ton of this low light, and with the sun at his back, everything bathed in the orange light. And then there's lots of historic paintings with the high sun, midday. There's just not a ton of paintings where you have a kind of a raking light from the side. And I think a lot of that is that it tends to be less picturesque when you have a whole bunch of long shadows that are parallel, because, you know, we try to avoid parallel lines in our paintings. And sometimes the raking light can really break up the form a lot, especially when you're painting rocks and cliffs. If you have, you know, more parallel lines, but also just if you have the, you know, wonderful kind of face of a cliff, and then you have the light coming from the side, where every little, you know, bump or crevice is you know, very strong dark shape in the middle of this nice white, or, you know, warm cream cliff. It ends up just being very distracting. So when I was out just now, I was looking for views generally where I had the sun either directly at my back or behind the subject, because it just kind of unifies the shapes more. So here's kind of a little sunset painting I did. And one thing that was interesting about this, you know, I talk a lot in my critiques and general about composition. And, you know, I have kind of a smaller foreground here of shadow, and then the kind of a larger middle ground of light, and then a small sky. There was a moment when I was painting this, because, you know, the shadow crept along, and the shadow got to about here. So I had a very large shadow area. And I was very tempted to, at that point, to move this whole shadow up. But I kind of like this area here, and you know, it is still a bit kind of, this is large, then this is a bit smaller, and this is a bit smaller still, and that's a bit smaller still. So I think it kind of works, but maybe this shadow could be just a touch higher, but then this gets smaller than that. So it's, you know, it's kind of hard to get all of these things to work together in a composition. So still not sure if it was the best choice. The other thing I did when I got back here to the studio was I just put an orange glaze. You can see it quite well around the little church there, where you can see how the glaze has landed in the impastos. But so I'm not going to really capture the glaze right now, but I just want to show you how I would have laid in, this kind of a subject where everything is bathed in. We'll just kind of do this area here. So, the last painting we saw how every little color needed to be captured. Here, I think you can really kind of mass in again. And, keeping it all quite orange. And then the shadow areas are just going to be very unified also. They're almost always the same color. I've played with a bit of the blues there, but and again, because this is a frontlit view, you do have to do a lot of drawing. Can't really hide stuff in the... And I'm going to be using both the shadow color and the light color to get my shapes. Here we're going to have to really mix, like any frontlit view, really mix each of the little changes in hue. But now, once we've come out of this kind of the grassy area up here, let's just finish. Now for this whole area here, I remember how I handled it outside, and it was, even though it's frontlit, I went back to that sort of backlit strategy where I would just mass in everything one kind of golden light color. I mean, leaving the kind of shadow areas, obviously. The large shadow areas. I think it's easier to do this sort of drawing with just painting over the... And I remember as I was doing this that I was looking at the kind of slight changes in hue, because again, it is a frontlit view, so you can kind of gradate stuff. And then it gets much greener as we get down below where the tide level can come up in sort of barnacles and stuff down here. So then after that, there was this kind of interesting, these were actually covered with fossils. It was kind of crazy. But they were really picking up this kind of purple. So I'm going to mix kind of a purple. I'm still using the same brush. Again, this idea that when you're massing in a similar area, you just keep using the same brush and make it a bit more purple. And again, I started massing in this area with medium and terps, But now that I'm painting into that masked in area, I'm just using pure paint because it's going to stick much better. And let's see. So after you've kind of got, let's see, we can try to find a few lighter, more yellow accents as well. And again, a lot of white in here, and I'm getting these nice kind of impastos, and so which again look really nice when you get in and glaze them. And once we have the whole kind of light area masked in, then I remember I just kind of went in and drew. So again, with our kind of our dark here, just kind of finding where the rock shapes were. And as I was painting this, these shadows, the sun was going around that way, so these shadows kind of get longer and shorter, and I was sort of picking the moment when I thought they were nice, more picturesque. And I remember at one point they got really long, and I actually preferred sort of the smaller amount. Here there's a bit of reflected light, but I can just put them all kind of in at the same, working my way across, and then paint into them. So we can then take this further back, a bit bluer. And any errors you make, if you kind of cut in a rock too much, you can definitely fix it. That's a bit too light, so we'll take it a bit darker. A bit darker still. And again, you want to have variety in your brushwork, so you want to have really small areas and then larger ones, and nice variety. Let's see, somebody was asking about, back to this idea of keeping your colors clean. I don't think you really, there's not really a lot of places in a landscape painting where you need to go black. So I think it's nice, this idea of restraint, to try to keep your darks not as dark as you could actually get them. And here there's a cast shadow, and so it's a lot of these other shadows are sort of looking into the shadow, whereas when you have it kind of cast, it's going to be picking up the blue from the sky. So some of these cast shadows have a bit of the blue. And then let's see, and draw this. And again, here I'm adding a lot of medium and terps again, so that I can kind of quickly cover, and we can keep the shadow areas quite thin. But whereas over here, I was using less medium and terps because I have to cover the white. And then as we get up to where there's a lot of reflected light, it's all going to get much lighter. Okay, and then down here in the shadow area, again, terps and medium, thin kind of soupy paint, and we can just kind of mass in variety of edge, some soft, some sharp, and kind of mass in this whole area. And then paint into it to get our areas that are darker still. And then I think also, so here I'm taking a lot more pigment and less light and dark, and you can put in some of these, taking more pigment and less medium and terps, and putting in some of these sort of reflected light from above, and then you can keep using the same brush, but then when I want to paint over an area, I won't add any medium or terps, and I'll just kind of hit it with this very dark, rich color. And we'll put in a bit of the greens down here too. I remember where it was in the golden light, it was very kind of a bright green, and then the area where it was in shadow, it became a much sort of more ultramarine, more cobalt blue. Even though you have just a ton of reflection in the water, you can kind of hint, and certainly where it crosses the whitewash, you can see them. And I think that's why I put this, when I saw there was a little wave there, if you put the white on the edge of the shadow, and then show what the shadow looks like show what the if you put the white in the light, and then you show the value and the hue change into the shadow, then it's going to give us the sense of the ambient light. And then as we get okay, so that's basically how I would lay in one of these golden light paintings. So basically we're back to the way you would lay in a backlit painting, by massing in a large area and then going through and picking out your accents. And the other thing about working like this is the other two views we saw were at midday, where the sun moves kind of very slowly. It doesn't change much in that angle. Whereas when you have that same angle of the sun, when it's very low, it's because it's going through so much atmosphere, it's very, very golden, but it's not going to be this sort of golden color for very long. So you have, maybe 15 minutes, half an hour as this shadow creeps along before it's all gone, especially if you want that golden light. So you kind of need a working method that's much quicker. So the backlit view, you mass in all your shadows and then paint into the soup. The front lit high sun painting, you have to do each color individually. And then the front lit low sun painting, you're back to where you can mass in general areas and then paint sort of accents into it. And I think that's a much quicker way of working than, clearly a quicker way, but it's the only way to really capture a scene like this. And you can, we've talked before about painting into an effect and painting out of an effect. And so those first two paintings, the effect stays the same. Whereas here you're painting into the effect, and you can do all the drawing. And then, like I was saying earlier, I was kind of deciding where I want the shadow. As it becomes more and more the effect I want, I make the changes at the very end. But painting into an effect where you have a very short time frame just requires a different way of working, where you're able to work quickly. And then the last thing, let's see, did I get to everything? Backlit scene. Oh, sorry, this idea of developing one's voice. So I never really tried to develop a style. And I actually had gallerists who were very important gallerists at the beginning of my career who I met, and they basically said they weren't going to take my paintings because I didn't have enough of a style. And I've never really tried to develop a style. I think if I have a style now, it happened just on its own. But I do think that you can take artists whose work you like. I certainly copied like a lot of Levitans and Corot's. I was just using books, and it's kind of hard to see the brushwork, but I did my best and studied them up close. But I think that if you just paint a lot, you're going to end up developing a style without pushing it. But I think definitely copying the work of artists who you do like will help you kind of move your own style towards what they did. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. To me, I love the way these guys paint. I'd love to paint like them. But I also just always felt like I want to go out and not develop a style, just try to paint what I see as honestly as I can. And then I think you're just going to end up developing a style on your own. So I hope I got to all the questions. Like I said, there was one more, and I'll try to get to that next month. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.